Hello there, my midnight souls. Tonight, we drift into the quiet tragedy behind one of the most enduring stories ever told. A small town wrapped in history and secrets. A girl who was never supposed to survive. And a stranger who was already there before the story began. The question that rests beneath all of it is this: what if the worst night of your life was never an accident? So, close your eyes. Breathe in the cool, still air. And let Elena Gilbert's story carry you somewhere soft and slow, where survival has a cost, and love arrives wearing grief's face. Mystic Falls, Virginia is the kind of town that looks, at first glance, like it was designed to be looked at and not examined too closely. The streets are wide and tree-lined. The houses old and well kept. The town square anchored by a clock and a war memorial, and the particular pride of a community that has never quite stopped living in its own past. There are founding family names carved into the stonework of public buildings and stitched into the social fabric of every gathering, every council meeting, every autumn festival. The kind of town where history is not something that happened elsewhere. It happened here, in these fields and on these roads. And the people who remain are the descendants of the people who made it. And they carry that weight with a combination of genuine devotion and something quieter and harder to name. Beneath all of it, beneath the charm and the civic pride and the familiar rhythms of small-town southern life, there is something older, something that has been present long before the founding families gave the town its name, long before the first church was built or the first roads were laid. Mystic Falls sits atop centuries of history it has chosen, collectively and deliberately, not to fully examine. The locals feel it sometimes, in the way certain streets feel different after dark, in the way the old cemetery at the edge of town seems to hold its silence a little too completely, in the way the oldest families speak about certain subjects with a care that suggests the words themselves are dangerous. Elena Gilbert grew up inside all of this without knowing any of it. To her, Mystic Falls was simply home, and the place where she had always been, where her parents worked and her friends lived, and her whole life was arranged in the comfortable, uncomplicated geography of someone who has never had reason to look beneath the surface of where she belongs. She was born on June 22nd, and she had her mother's eyes. This is the first thing most people noticed about Elena, and it is also, as it turns out, not entirely accurate, because Miranda Gilbert was not Elena's biological mother, but Miranda raised her from infancy and loved her without condition or reservation, and the eyes that people saw as Miranda's legacy were simply Elena's own eyes, claimed by the family that chose her. The truth of Elena's birth, that she was the daughter of Grayson Gilbert and a teenage girl named Isabel, and given up quietly and adopted legally and folded into the Gilbert family with a seamlessness that suggested the town itself was helping to keep the secret, was not something Elena knew. It was not something she had any reason to suspect. She was a Gilbert. She had always been a Gilbert. The house on Maple Drive was her house. The family inside it was her family. And the history of how she came to be there was buried so deeply beneath ordinary love that it had no weight in her daily life at all. Grayson Gilbert was a doctor, quiet and steady in the way of men who've spent years managing other people's emergencies and learned to keep their own reactions in reserve. He coached Elena's soccer team when she was 9 and attended every school play she was ever reluctant to be in, and made breakfast on Sunday mornings with the particular focused contentment of someone who knows exactly where his happiness lives. He had a study on the second floor that smelled of old books and something faintly chemical, and the door was sometimes closed in a way that suggested the work inside was important, though Elena had never thought to wonder too carefully about what that work was. Miranda Gilbert was warmer in a more visible way, the kind of mother whose love expressed itself in motion, in the extra place set at the table for whoever Elena brought home, in the way she remembered the names of every friend and teacher and peripheral figure in her children's lives, and the particular attentiveness she brought to the task of knowing her daughter completely. She and Elena had the relationship that some mothers and daughters spend their whole lives trying to build and never quite manage. They argued sometimes, as all mothers and daughters do, about small things mostly, about curfews and homework, and the particular teenage conviction that parents are constitutionally incapable of understanding anything. But beneath the arguments was a current of genuine closeness that Elena would not fully understand the value of until it was gone. Jeremy Gilbert was 2 years younger than Elena, and he was the kind of younger brother who was simultaneously annoying and deeply necessary. He had their father's quietness without their father's steadiness, a sensitivity that he had learned young to hide behind sullenness and performance, and the careful construction of an exterior that said he did not care about things he cared about enormously. He and Elena loved each other in the way of siblings who have never had to articulate it, who simply assume the other's presence as a foundational fact of existence. They bickered and competed, and occasionally said things they did not mean, and underneath all of it ran a loyalty that neither of them would have known how to put into words, but that was as real as anything in either of their lives. Elena was 16, going on 17 in the year that everything changed. She was a cheerleader, though not the kind who made it her entire identity. She was a good student, conscientious about her work without being rigid about it. She was well liked, genuinely rather than strategically, because Elena Gilbert had never learned how to be cruel and had never wanted to. She had 2 best friends, Bonnie Bennett, whose grandmother was one of the town's more quietly significant figures, and Caroline Forbes, whose mother was the county sheriff and whose heart was approximately 3 times larger than she ever allowed people to see. The 3 of them had been close since middle school, and their friendship had the comfortable texture of something that's been worn in over time, soft in all the places where it first chafed. She had a boyfriend, or something close to it, named Matt Donovan. Matt was kind and honest and genuinely in love with her in the uncomplicated way of someone who has not yet learned to be otherwise. Elena cared about him. She also knew how in some quiet part of herself she hadn't yet had reason to examine, that caring about someone and being meant for them were not always the same thing. The night of May 23rd began with a party at the Lockwood estate. The Lockwoods were one of Mystic Falls' founding families, possessed of an old house and a certain quality of social authority that expressed itself in the throwing of parties that everyone attended because not attending was simply not done. Elena had gone with Caroline and Bonnie, had spent the early part of the evening doing what teenagers do at parties, moving from room to room, talking to people, laughing at things that weren't quite as funny as they seemed in the moment, performing the social rituals that would one day feel like practice for something, but in the present just felt like a Saturday night. And by 10 o'clock, she was tired. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the effort of being social, of resenting the version of herself that knew how to be at a party. She stepped outside and called her parents. She asked them to come and get her. Her mother answered, warm and unhurried, and said of course, they'd be there in 20 minutes. Elena waited outside in the early summer air, listening to the noise of the party behind her and the quiet of the Lockwood grounds ahead of her. She didn't know that the phone call she had just made was the last ordinary thing she would ever do. She didn't know that the 20 minutes she was about to wait were the last 20 minutes of the life she had always assumed she would continue living. She didn't know about Wickery Bridge, or the water beneath it, or the cold that was coming. She stood in the dark and waited for her parents, and the night felt like any other night. And that is the most devastating thing about the worst moments of a life. They almost never announce themselves. They simply arrive, quiet as rain, and by the time you understand what they are, you are already inside them, and the world you lived in before has already become something you will spend the rest of your time trying to remember clearly. Wickery Bridge has its own history in Mystic Falls, as most things in that town do. It is not a large bridge. It spans a section of the river that is maybe 30 feet across at its widest point, and it carries a two-lane road that connects one side of town to the other through a stretch of trees. It is the kind of bridge that is invisible when everything is fine, and the kind of infrastructure that only becomes significant when something goes wrong on it. And things have gone wrong on Wickery Bridge before. The water beneath it is cold even in summer, fed by underground springs, dark in the way of water that does not receive much direct light. The railing on the east side had been repaired twice in the last 10 years, and both times the repairs had been prompted by accidents that the town had absorbed and moved past and filed away in the part of its collective memory reserved for things that are sad but not surprising. Grayson Gilbert was driving. Miranda was in the passenger seat. They were 2/3 of the way across the bridge when something went wrong with the car. A tire, the road. A moment of lost control that happened in the space of a second and then could not be undone. The car struck the railing on the east side and went through it and over the edge, and the water came up to meet them with the indifferent force of something that does not know it is ending anything. Elena was in the back seat. She was alive. The cold was enormous and immediate and total, and then it was the only thing there was. The water was not like anything Elena had been prepared for. She'd swum in lakes before, had felt the cold of early spring water on summer-adjacent evenings, had experienced the particular shock of submerging too quickly into something colder than expected. None of that was preparation for this. The river beneath Wickery Bridge was fed by underground springs that kept it cold through every season, and in late May, that coldness had not yet been touched by the warmth that summer would eventually bring down from the surface into the deeper currents. It was the kind of cold that does not wait for the body to adjust, that does not offer the brief mercy of gradual acclimation. It simply enters through the skin and into the blood, and down into the place where the body keeps its most essential functions, and it begins immediately and without apology to slow everything down. The car had gone in nose first, the hood crumpling against the riverbed on impact, the windshield giving way in a cascade of safety glass that the water caught and dispersed before it could do the damage it might have done in air. Water flooded the interior with a speed that was almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. Not violent exactly, and not dramatic in the way that drowning is depicted in films, but completely indifferent to the fact that there were people inside trying to understand what had just happened to them. Elena had hit something during the impact, the door frame or the back of the seat in front of her, and there was a ringing in her skull that made thought difficult and sequential reasoning almost impossible. She was aware of the water rising. She was aware of the darkness outside the windows, absolute and total. She was aware of her parents in the front seats, her father's hands on the steering wheel that was no longer useful, her mother's voice saying something she could not quite hear over the roaring in her ears, and the sound of water finding every available space inside the car. She tried to move toward them. Her body was slow, confused by the cold and the shock of impact, responding with the reluctance of something that has been told it is in danger, but cannot yet determine the appropriate direction of escape. Her fingers found the back of her mother's seat, and she pushed against it, trying to pull herself forward, trying to close the distance between herself and the two people she needed to reach. The car was settling as she moved, tilting slightly to the left, where the riverbed was uneven beneath it, and the water was at her chest now and rising, and she understood in the wordless and completely reliable way that the body understands things before the conscious mind catches up, that she needed to get out of the car entirely. There was no getting out. The doors on a submerged and rapidly sinking car do not open the way doors are supposed to open, in the pressure of water against the exterior holding them closed with a force that requires either a calm and trained mind executing a specific technique, or a kind of physical strength that 16-year-old girls in freezing water do not typically possess. Elena tried the door handle. She tried it again. Her hands were already beginning to lose sensation, the cold working its way into the smaller muscles and tendons first, stealing dexterity before it stole anything else. The door did not move. The window was closed, and she had nothing to break it with, and the water was at her shoulders now, and she drew one breath that was mostly water and coughed it back out, and drew another that was air, the last pocket of it remaining near the rear ceiling of the car. She did not lose consciousness in those final seconds, and this is something she would struggle with later, in the months of recovery and grief that followed. The fact that she was aware, that she did not simply slip away into unconsciousness and wake up on the bank with no knowledge of the intervening time. She was present for those last moments inside the car, present in the terrible and clarifying way that comes when the body understands it is approaching something from which there may be no return. Her parents were in front of her, and she could not reach them. The water was everywhere, cold and dark and completely without mercy. The last of the air was gone, and then something changed in the darkness around the car. Something that was not the current shifting, and not the vehicle continuing to settle. Something that moved with a direction and a purpose that the water itself did not have. Now Stefan Salvatore had been in Mystic Falls for less than 48 hours. He had not intended to return. The town of his birth, the place where he had grown up in the 1840s, where he had been human and young and alive in the fullest sense of that word, where he had had a father and a brother, and a future he had imagined for himself in the particular detailed way of young men who do not yet know that futures are not guaranteed, wasn't somewhere he came back to willingly or without cost. He had returned perhaps 3 times in the century and a half since his transformation, and each visit had been brief and purposeful, and shadowed by the weight of what this place represented. The memories that lived in Mystic Falls were not the kind that rewarded revisitation. They were old and sharp, and they cut differently depending on which angle they were approached from. And Stefan had learned over the long years of his existence that some places are best kept at a careful distance. But something had pulled him back this time, and the pull had been different from the impulse or the restlessness that sometimes moved him from one place to another. It was quieter than impulse and more persistent. The way a sound heard once in passing continues to echo at the edges of hearing long after the source has gone. He had been in the mountains of North Carolina when he first felt it. A particular kind of attention his mind kept returning to. An orientation that had no clear object. In Georgia, it had become impossible to dismiss. He had driven north through the warm spring evening, telling himself he was simply following curiosity, simply returning to a place he had known, simply answering a call that might amount to nothing when he arrived to meet it. He had entered Mystic Falls from the south and parked near the edge of the older part of town and walked, which was not efficient, but which felt necessary in the way that walking sometimes does, when the mind needs time to close the distance between where it has been and where it is now. He had walked through streets he had known in an entirely different form, past houses that had been rebuilt, and trees that had grown from saplings he could remember into something large and permanent. He had crossed Wickery Bridge once already, heading east into the darker residential streets, and he had stopped in the middle of it to look at the water below. The river was visible in the low light, the surface moving with the particular indifference of water that has been doing this for centuries and will be doing it long after the bridge above it is gone. He had stood there for 2 minutes, or perhaps 3, aware of nothing specific, feeling only the familiar and never entirely comfortable weight of his own long existence and the quality of silence that Mystic Falls generated after midnight. He was on the western bank, moving back toward where he had left the car when he heard the impact. He heard it before he saw it. The sound of metal striking the bridge railing, which was a sharp and industrial sound entirely out of place in the quiet of the night. He followed immediately by the longer and more complex sound of the railing giving way, and then the enormous sound of the car breaking the surface of the water below. For a fraction of a second he was entirely still. the complete and controlled stillness of a vampire processing incoming information at a speed the body is simply waiting to serve. Then he was moving, and the distance between the western bank and the place where the car had gone in was nothing, was less than nothing, was a problem that his speed solved before his conscious mind had finished forming the thought. He entered the water without hesitation, without removing anything, without the human calculation of what the cold would do and whether it was worth it. The cold was not a relevant factor. His body registered it. He was aware of it the way he was aware of wind or barometric pressure, as a fact of the environment rather than a threat to his functioning. He moved through the water with the fluid efficiency of something that does not need to breathe, that is not fighting its own body's panic demand for air, that can direct its entire attention to the task of finding the car and finding it quickly. The car had come to rest at an angle on the riverbed, the front end lower than the rear, the roof crushed slightly from the impact, the interior completely flooded. Stefan reached it in seconds. He could see in the darkness that would have been total and impenetrable for human eyes. The vampire's perception extended into ranges of light that the human visual system cannot access, and making the murk of the river navigable in a way it would not have been for anyone relying on ordinary sight. What he saw when he reached the car was a family. A man in the driver's seat, conscious and struggling, his hands moving with purpose against the door that would not open. A woman in the passenger seat, also conscious, her head turned toward the back seat, her mouth forming words that the water around her swallowed before they could travel anywhere. And in the back seat, a girl, still, hair floating in the current, her face turned upward toward the ceiling where the last air had been. He went for the driver's side door first, because it was nearest, and because the man inside was the one still moving with evident intention, the one whose consciousness was still clearly present and directing his body toward survival. The door did not resist him. He gripped it and pulled with a fraction of his actual strength, and the pressure differential that had been holding it closed surrendered immediately, water moving freely now through the open frame. Grayson Gilbert looked at him. There are moments in a dying that clarify rather than confuse. Moments when the usual filters and mediations through which consciousness processes the world fall away entirely, and what remains is direct and immediate and unambiguous. Grayson Gilbert was a doctor who had spent his career in emergency medicine, who had a particular kind of intelligence that operated best under pressure, who had also spent years as a quiet and careful member of a council that knew more about Mystic Falls and its history than most of the town's residents would ever be told. He knew what it meant that someone had reached his door this quickly. He knew what the temperature of the hand gripping the door frame indicated. He knew what he was looking at, and he knew it with the complete and unambiguous recognition of a man who has studied something long enough to identify it without hesitation, even in conditions of extreme duress. He was looking at a vampire. His wife's hand was in his. He could feel her fingers, her pulse, the particular pressure of her grip. He could feel the cold of the water through his clothing and the pain in his chest from the impact, and the seconds passing as seconds pass, when there are not many of them remaining. He could feel the weight of everything, the life he had built, the children he had loved, the work he had tried to do, the ordinary and irreplaceable texture of a life that had been good and was ending in the dark at the bottom of a river. He looked at Stefan Salvatore and he said his daughter's name. Not his own name, and not his wife's name, and not a general plea for help or salvation. He said Elena. A single word, precise and direct, and with it he pointed toward the back seat. He held Stefan's gaze for the length of time it took to be certain the message had been received and understood and accepted. He did not beg. He did not explain. He had perhaps 3 seconds, and he used them with the same economy and precision he had brought to every emergency he had ever managed. And then he released Stefan's gaze and turned back to his wife, and the choice he had just made was made, and it was not a choice that could be unmade. As Stefan has carried that moment through every subsequent day of his existence, not with the blurring that time sometimes mercifully brings to the things that hurt most, but with a precision that seems to increase rather than diminish as the months pass. The specific quality of Grayson Gilbert's eyes in those final seconds, the love in them, the terrible clarity, the complete absence of self-pity, is not something that fades. The angle at which the man had turned his head, the temperature of the water at exactly that depth, the sound of Miranda's voice, still speaking words that were dissolving into the current before they could reach anyone. These details do not soften. They remain exact, preserved in the manner of things that matter too much to be allowed the ordinary decay of memory. He went to the back seat. He went to Elena. She was beyond consciousness by then, or close enough to that threshold that the distinction was not practically meaningful. The cold and the impact and the absence of breathable air had done their combined work with the efficiency of natural processes that do not consider the preferences of the people they are acting upon. The girl in the back seat was entirely still, her body having surrendered the struggle that consciousness directs and entered the quieter state that precedes whatever comes after. Stefan reached her through the open door and lifted her free of the car with a care that was deliberate and total, managing her weight and her position and the resistance of the current with a control that left no margin for anything unnecessary. He was aware, as he always was in moments requiring physical intervention with human beings, of the enormous disproportion between his strength and her fragility. He was aware of how easily strength of this magnitude becomes a different kind of harm when it is not precisely governed. He brought her up through the dark water toward the surface. The bank was perhaps 20 feet away at his nearest point, and he crossed that distance with Elena held against him in a way that kept her face clear of the water, that kept her airway open for the breathing that he needed her to begin doing again. He came up out of the shallows and onto the grass, and he set her down with the gentleness of someone who understands completely what is at stake in the setting down. He checked her breathing and found it absent, checked her pulse and found it present but barely, and he performed the careful mechanical intervention that a drowning victim requires. The compression and the clearance and the patient repeated action that asks a stopped body to remember what it is supposed to do. She breathed. The breath came back with the abrupt and inelegant urgency of someone who has been away and is returning without particular grace. A cough and a shudder, and then the unsteady rhythm of lungs re-establishing their own authority. Stefan listened to her heartbeat move from its barely there thread back toward something that carried real force behind it, and he felt something that he would not have been able to name in that moment, but that existed somewhere in the vicinity of relief, though relief was too simple a word for something that was also grief and guilt and the beginning of a wait was going to carry for a very long time. He looked at the water. He looked at the place where the car had gone in. The disturbance of the surface already beginning to settle back toward its normal state. The river reasserting its indifference to what had just happened within it. He did not go back in. This is the fact he has returned to most often. In the long examination that follows a choice of this magnitude, he did not go back. He has asked himself across the months and the years whether the time existed, whether a different version of that night was possible, in which he set Elena on the bank and turned around and went back into the water and reached the front seat of the car before whatever remained of Grayson and Miranda Gilbert was beyond reaching. He has run the calculation with the precision of a mind that has spent over a century and a half learning to assess situations clearly. He was fast. He was capable of things that no human rescuer could have managed. But Elena had needed intervention on the bank before he could leave her, and the seconds that passed during that intervention were seconds in which the river continued its work. The car had shifted further during his ascent, moved by the current into a different position on the uneven riverbed. And Grayson Gilbert had made a choice with his last available seconds, and that choice had been Elena. And Stefan had honored it, and honoring it had used time that could not be recovered or applied elsewhere. He was gone before the first car stopped on the bridge above. He heard the tires and the voices and moved into the tree line with the unhurried speed of something that does not need to be seen and knows how not to be. He stood in the darkness between the trees and he watched the bridge come alive with light and movement. People emerging from their vehicles and leaning over the railing and calling into the dark below. And he watched Elena on the bank where he had left her, soaked and still and breathing, the most important of those three things. And he waited until he was certain that the people on the bridge had seen her, and that the connection had been made between the emergency they were registering and the girl lying on the grass below the eastern bank. Then he left. He moved through the trees and back toward where he had parked, and he sat in his car for a long time before he started the engine. Long enough for the sounds from the bridge to change in character from panic to the organized urgency of emergency response. Long enough to be reasonably certain that everything that could be done for Elena Gilbert by people with warm hands and medical equipment was being done. She had seen him. In the final coherent moment before the cold and the oxygen deprivation had taken her under completely, she had been aware of something in the water around the car. A presence, a face, something that moved with a certainty and a calm that had no business existing in that situation. She had felt the hand, and this above everything else would persist in her memory past the blurring that claimed most of the rest of it. The hand was cold, and it was strong, and it held her with a steadiness that nothing in the chaos of that night should have been capable of, and it moved her through the water toward the surface with an assurance that suggested it had always known exactly where the surface was and exactly how to get her there. She would not be able to describe the face. She would try in the first weeks of her recovery, because there was a survivor's need to account for what had happened, to build a coherent narrative out of the fragments that the trauma had left her. There had been someone in the water. She knew that much. The hand was real, the cold was real, The being moved was real, but the face remained at the edge of resolution, visible only when she did not look directly at it, dissolving whenever she tried to hold it clearly in her mind. The emergency services arrived at Wickery Bridge at 12:47 in the morning. Elena Gilbert was found on the eastern bank, conscious and breathing and suffering from hypothermia and a head injury, and the kind of shock that the body enters when it has been asked to absorb more than its usual capacity. Grayson and Miranda Gilbert were recovered from the submerged vehicle by the dive team that arrived 40 minutes after the first responders. They had not survived. The official determination would be drowning, complicated by injuries sustained during the initial impact. And the bridge railing that had failed was examined and found to have been adequately maintained. The accident was determined to be the result of a tire failure at an unfortunate moment on a bridge with no shoulder and no margin for error. The report did not mention the cold hand in the water. There was no mechanism in the official report for mentioning it, no category into which it could be placed that would not require explanations the report was not equipped to contain. And Elena herself, when she was well enough to speak to anyone, found that the memory was not something she could present to other people with any confidence. It felt real. It was real. But it was also the memory of someone who had nearly drowned. Someone whose brain had been deprived of oxygen and subjected to extreme cold at the moment the memory was formed. And there were people, medical professionals, grief counselors, the well-meaning adults who surrounded her in the weeks that followed, who were ready to gently offer her alternative explanations for what she thought she remembered. She stopped trying to explain it. She kept it, but she kept it privately, in the part of herself where she put the things that were true, but that she did not yet have the language or the context to share. Jenna Summers arrived at the hospital in the early hours of the morning, having driven from Richmond with the particular focused urgency of someone who has received news that requires immediate physical movement toward the people it concerns. She came into Elena's room and sat down beside the bed and took Elena's hand, and she did not say the things that people sometimes say in these moments, because she was not someone who reached for comfortable untruths when honest silence was available. She sat with Elena in the silence, and Elena looked at her aunt's face, and the understanding arrived in the way that certain understandings arrive, not as information delivered from outside, but as a recognition of something already known, already present, already true, simply waiting for the moment when the mind was ready to acknowledge it. Her parents were not coming. The bridge and the water and the dark had taken them, and they were not coming. And Elena was 16 years old, and she was the only member of her immediate family who had come up from the river, and that fact was enormous and cold and total and would take years, perhaps all the remaining years of her life, to fully reckon with. Outside the hospital window, Mystic Falls continued in its usual quiet, the night moving toward morning at its customary pace, the streets empty and the houses dark, and the clock in the square marking the time with the indifferent regularity of something that does not know it is measuring grief. The town looked the same as it always had. It would look the same tomorrow. The ordinary life of the place, its rhythms and its routines, and its long continuous relationship with its own history, did not pause for what had happened on the bridge. But something had entered the Mystic Falls that night and then departed, and the fact of its passage had changed things in ways that would not be visible for months. A vampire had been in the river, had made a choice in the dark at the direction of a dying man, had carried a girl up through the cold water and set her breathing on the bank, and then disappeared into the trees before anyone arrived to ask him what he was doing there. He carried the knowledge of what he had done and what he had not been able to do back out of Mystic Falls and into the spring night, and the night absorbed him, and the road took him south, and the town behind him settled back into its familiar quiet. He would come back. He had not finished whatever it was that had pulled him here to begin with, and the night at the bridge had added something to that unfinished quality, rather than resolving it. But for now, he drove south through the dark and said nothing to anyone, and carried Grayson Gilbert's last words in the place where the things that cannot be put down are kept. And on a hospital bed in Mystic Falls, Elena Gilbert lay awake in the blue-grey light before dawn, breathing the recycled air of a recovery room, feeling the particular and enormous silence of a world from which her parents had been subtracted, and trying to understand how she had come to be the only one the river had given back. The summer after the accident was the longest summer of Elena Gilbert's life, and she has had summers since that contained more outward danger, more visible catastrophe, more events that would register on any reasonable scale of extraordinary experience. But this one was long in the particular way that grief makes time long, not by filling it with things, but by emptying it, by removing the usual scaffolding of ordinary expectation that makes days feel like they are moving toward something, and leaving in its place an expanse of hours that had to be crossed one at a time with no particular confidence that the crossing was taking you anywhere useful. The house on Maple Drive was the same house it had always been. This was one of the harder things. Elena had understood in some abstract way that grief changes everything, had heard this said by adults in various contexts, had absorbed it as a general truth about the nature of loss. What she had not understood, could not have understood without experiencing it, was how aggressively the physical world refuses to participate in that change. And the kitchen was the same kitchen. The stairs were the same stairs. The smell of the house in the morning, that particular combination of wood and fabric, and the faint trace of her mother's perfume that lived in the upholstery of the living room furniture, was exactly the same as it had always been. The world had been rearranged at its most fundamental level, and the house had not received the message, and navigating that discrepancy every day was its own specific and exhausting form of grief work. Jenna moved in within the week. She brought 2 suitcases and her laptop, and the particular kind of determined practicality that people deploy when they are doing something enormous and frightening and do not want to examine it too closely, because examining it too closely might make it feel impossible. She was 24 years old and a graduate student in literature, and she had never been responsible for anyone other than herself. And now she was the legal guardian of a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old who were both, in their different ways, in pieces. She handled this with a grace that was real even when it was imperfect. She made meals that were sometimes burned and sometimes surprisingly good, and always present, which was the most important thing. She showed up to the school meetings and signed the forms, and sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and was simply there, which Elena would understand much later was not a small thing to offer someone whose primary experience of the preceding months had been the sudden and total absence of the people who were supposed to be there. Jeremy folded inward. Well, this was not a surprise to Elena, who had always understood her brother's emotional architecture well enough to know that he processed pain by moving away from it rather than toward it, by creating distance between himself and the source of his suffering through whatever means were available. In the first weeks, the means were mostly sleep. Jeremy slept enormous amounts, 12 and 14 hours at a stretch, in the way of someone whose consciousness has decided that the waking world is currently not worth the trouble of inhabiting. Then the sleep normalized and the withdrawal found other expressions. He stopped going to the places he had previously gone. He dropped out of the social arrangements that had structured his year. He began spending time with people who were on the peripheral edges of his previous social world, a people Elena recognized as the category of friend that teenagers acquire when they are not looking for friendship, so much as looking for somewhere to be that requires nothing of them emotionally. She watched this happen, and she could not stop it. She tried. She knocked on his door and sat on the edge of his bed and said the things she could think of to say, and sometimes he responded with more than monosyllables, and sometimes he didn't, and the conversations that resulted were never quite equal to the distance she was trying to cross. This was one of the specific tortures of that summer, being close enough to see her brother disappearing and being unable to do anything that actually helped. She had always been someone who could fix things, who could identify the problem and apply the appropriate solution, and produce a better outcome through the application of sufficient effort and care. Grief was not responsive to effort and care in that way. It moved according to its own logic, in its own time, and the people inside it could not be managed or optimized back to wholeness, no matter how much someone who loved them was willing to try. She quit cheerleading in June. The decision arrived less as a conscious choice and more as an acknowledgement of something that had already become true. She had not gone to a single practice since the accident, had not responded to the texts from her teammates, had not been able to locate in herself the person who had cared about that particular activity and that particular form of belonging. It was not that cheerleading was trivial. It was that it belonged to the before, to the version of her life that had been organized around assumptions that no longer held, and she could not find a way to carry it across the dividing line of May 23rd into whatever the after was going to be. The diary was where she was most honest. She had kept a journal since she was 12, inconsistently, in the way of someone who goes to it when she needs it and neglects it when things are fine. In the weeks immediately following the accident, she had not written anything. She had not been able to find the interior quiet that writing requires, had not been able to slow down enough to put language to what was happening inside her. But in late June, she picked up a new journal, because the old one belonged to the before, and she did not want to write the after inside it, and she began again. The entries from that summer are not dramatic. They do not reach for the large words, loss, grief, devastation, that might seem commensurate with what she was experiencing. They are instead specific and quiet, the record of a person trying to stay oriented in a world that has shifted beneath her feet. She wrote about ordinary things, what she had eaten, whether she had slept, what Jeremy had said at breakfast, whether Jenna had burned the pasta again. She wrote about the things she missed that were not her parents, because writing directly about missing her parents was still too enormous to approach. She wrote about the sound of her father's car in the driveway, about the way her mother had always known without being told, when Elena needed to talk and when she needed to be left alone. She wrote around the center of the grief rather than at it, circling it the way you circle a wound that is not yet ready to be examined directly. She also wrote about the bridge, not often and not at length, but she returned to it in the entries from that summer, with a regularity that suggested it was the thing she was most trying to work out. She wrote about what she remembered, which was fragmented and unreliable and shot through with the distortions that trauma and hypothermia produce in memory. She wrote about the hand. She returned to the hand again and again, trying to describe it with enough precision to make it real on the page, to give it enough substance that it could be examined rather than simply felt. Cold, strong, certain, moving her through the water without hesitation. She wrote, "I know someone was there. I know it. And I know it wasn't anyone ordinary. And I don't know what to do with knowing something I can't explain and can't prove and can't stop thinking about." She left that entry without a conclusion, which was the honest thing to do, because there was no conclusion available. Bonnie Bennett came to the house on Maple Drive twice a week through the whole of June and most of July. She did not always stay long, and she did not always say very much, but she came with the reliability of someone who has decided that showing up is the primary obligation and is going to meet it regardless of whether showing up feels useful or welcome. Bonnie had a quality of stillness that was unusual in teenagers, a capacity for simply being present without requiring the presence to be productive or conversational or anything other than what it was. Elena found this easier than the alternative. Well-meaning people kept trying to give her things, comfort, perspective, the assurance that it would get better, and Bonnie mostly just sat beside her on the porch in the summer evenings and let the silence be whatever it needed to be. Bonnie also felt things that she was not yet able to name or account for. Her grandmother, Sheila Bennett, had been trying to tell her for years that the Bennett women had a particular relationship to the world that went beyond ordinary perception, that there was a history and a power in their bloodline that Bonnie owed it to herself to understand. Bonnie had spent most of her adolescence treating this information with the affectionate skepticism that teenagers bring to the more unusual beliefs of their elders. But that summer, sitting beside Elena in the evenings, she felt something around her friend that she could not dismiss, a quality of significance, a sense that Elena Gilbert was at the center of something whose full shape was not yet visible. She did not say this to Elena. It was not the kind of thing you say to someone who is already managing more than enough, but she felt it, and she filed it in the growing category of things she was beginning to take seriously. Caroline Forbes expressed her love in motion and volume, which was simply who Caroline was and had always been. She organized things. She appeared at the house with food and with plans and with the specific, energetic care of someone who is most comfortable when she is doing something visible and concrete on behalf of the people she loves. As she dragged Elena to the mall twice and to the movies once, and both times Elena went without fully wanting to, and came back feeling, if not better exactly, then slightly less sealed inside herself. which was perhaps what Caroline had intended. Caroline also cried in her car on the way home from these outings, not wanting Elena to see it, not wanting to make Elena's grief about Caroline's feelings. Bonnie knew about the car crying because Bonnie knew most things about Caroline, and she did not tell Elena, and this was exactly the right call. The town of Mystic Falls held Elena with the complicated embrace of a community that has known a family for generations and experiences the loss of members of that family as something partially collective. People brought food. People stopped her in the grocery store to say things that were meant to help, and sometimes did, and sometimes made the grief feel more exposed than she wanted it to be in public. The founding family connections meant that her parents' deaths were a matter of community significance as well as personal loss. And there were memorial arrangements and a small ceremony and a bench in the town square dedicated to Grayson and Miranda Gilbert that Eleanor visited once and then avoided for months because the permanence of a bench was a particular kind of unbearable. She went back to school in September. This was a decision she made for reasons that were partly practical and partly the result of a conversation she had with herself in late August that went approximately like this. The before is gone, and it is not coming back. And the question is not how to return to it, but how to be a person in the after. And being a person in the after requires eventually the decision to attempt it. She was not healed. She was not even close to healed. She was a girl who had lost her parents 4 months ago and was carrying that loss in every part of herself and had no particular reason to believe that going back to school would make any of it easier. But she was also a girl who had survived the unsurvivable, who had been brought up from the bottom of a river by a hand she could not explain. And she had come to feel in some quiet and not entirely comfortable way that the survival meant something, that it placed an obligation on her, not to be happy, not to be recovered, but to try, to show up, to be Elena Gilbert in the after, even though she was not yet sure who that was. The night before the first day of junior year, she sat at her desk and opened the diary. She wrote for a long time, longer than most of the summer entries, and what she wrote was not about her parents or the bridge or the hand in the water. She wrote about the girl she had been before May 23rd, the cheerleader, the honor student, the girl with 2 parents and a plan, and the ordinary, comfortable confidence of someone who has not yet learned that plans are provisional. She wrote about that girl with care and without contempt, the way you write about someone you loved who is no longer present. And then she wrote, I don't know who I am now, but I think the only way to find out is to start moving again. So tomorrow I'm going to go to school, and I'm going to try. She closed the journal and looked at the window and the dark outside it. Sat somewhere in Mystic Falls, the clock in the square was marking the hour, its mechanism as regular and indifferent as it had always been. The house around her was quiet. Jenna asleep down the hall. Jeremy's light still on under his door, in the way it had been most nights of that summer. The same house, the same town, the same girl, and entirely different. She did not know that in the small rented room on the other side of Mystic Falls, someone else was also awake in the late summer dark. She did not know that the stranger in that room was there because of her, or that she had met him once already, in circumstances neither of them had chosen, in cold water under a bridge on the worst night of her life. She did not know that the year of grief was ending, and that what was coming next would ask more of her than the grief had, and then give her more than the grief had too, in the complicated accounting of lives that insist on continuing to happen. She only knew the night and the quiet and the modest and difficult promise she had just made to herself on the page. Tomorrow, she would try. September 7th arrived the way first days of school always arrive in small towns, with the particular nervous energy of a community reassembling itself after the dispersal of summer. Students returning to the familiar architecture of hallways and lockers and the social arrangements that had been on pause for 3 months. Mystic Falls High School filled up in the morning with the sounds and movements of people finding their places again, locating the versions of themselves that belong to this specific context, slipping back into the roles that the school year required, with the practiced ease of people who have performed this particular re-entry enough times to know its rhythms by heart. The hallways were loud in the way of hallways that had been empty for 3 months and are now suddenly full, every surface catching and returning sound, the particular acoustic of a building that is doing what it was built to do. Elena drove herself. This was new. She had gotten her license in July, one of the practical milestones that Jenna had quietly ensured happened despite everything. Understanding with the instinct of someone learning on the job what guardianship required, the competence and forward motion, were things grief could not be allowed to entirely consume. The truck had been her parents', and she was aware of this every time she sat in the driver's seat, aware of it in the particular way she was aware of all the things that had belonged to the before, as a fact that was true and present and had to be held without being surrendered to. She had made her peace with the truck over the summer in increments, the way she had made her peace with most things, not by resolving the feeling, but by returning to it often enough that its edges became familiar, that she could touch it without flinching every time. She sat in the parking lot for 2 full minutes before going in. This was not paralysis. It was the acknowledgement, deliberate and honest, that what she was about to do required preparation, that walking back through those doors, as the girl whose parents had died on Wickery Bridge 4 months ago, was going to cost something. And she wanted to be clear about that cost before she was asked to pay it. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and looked at the building and let herself feel the weight of it without trying to make it lighter. Then she picked up her bag and got out of the truck. Bonnie was waiting at the entrance. She had been there for 20 minutes already, which Elena knew because Bonnie's car was already in the lot, and Bonnie was not someone who arrived places 20 minutes early for ordinary reasons. She had been there because she had understood, without being told, that this was a morning that required someone to be physically present at the beginning of it, visible and waiting, before anything else was asked of Elena. She did not say anything particularly significant when Elena walked up, and there were no speeches about courage or fresh starts or the particular vocabulary of resilience that well-meaning people had been offering Elena all summer. Bonnie simply fell into step beside her, and the two of them went inside together, and the morning began in the only way mornings can begin, which is simply by starting. The hallways of Mystic Falls High were familiar and faintly destabilizing in the specific way of spaces that are associated entirely with a previous version of your life. Elena recognized everything. The smell of the building, the industrial cleaning product that was used on the floors, the particular echo of the corridors, the arrangement of the lockers, and the places where different groups of people naturally clustered before the first bell. She recognized all of it, and the recognition carried a secondary sensation she had not anticipated, which was that all of this familiarity now belonged to a person who no longer fully existed. The girl who had walked these hallways last spring had had 2 parents and a future she had not yet questioned, and the ordinary confidence of someone whose foundational assumptions have never been tested. That girl was gone. The girl walking the hallways now was someone else, still being determined, and the familiarity of the surroundings did not make the navigation easier. If anything, it made it harder, because the contrast between the unchanged environment and the enormously changed person moving through it was a kind of information that required constant processing. She fielded the condolences with the grace she had been practicing all summer, and they came in various forms. The brief embrace from the girl she had been on the cheer squad with, the hand on the arm from a teacher whose class she had always liked, the verbal acknowledgements from people she knew well and some she barely knew at all, offered with varying degrees of comfort and varying degrees of accuracy about what she actually needed to hear. She accepted all of them without impatience, because she understood that the people offering them were trying, and that trying deserved acknowledgement even when the attempt did not quite land. But by the time she reached her first class, she was already carrying the particular fatigue of sustained social performance, the exhaustion that comes from managing your own emotional presentation for an extended period in a context that does not allow for the kind of honesty that actual rest would require. Caroline found her between first and second period at their established meeting point near the science wing. And the look on Caroline's face when she saw Elena was the look she'd been wearing all summer. Fierce love and barely contained anxiety in a combination that Caroline had never quite been able to modulate down to something less visible. She asked how Elena was doing in the tone of someone for whom the answer mattered enormously and personally, and Elena said she was okay, which was true in the sense that she was upright and present and managing, and Caroline accepted this because she had learned over the summer that managing was what was available and that demanding more than what was available in a school hallway before second period was not an act of love. The morning passed in the way of first days, schedules confirmed, new seating arrangements navigated, teachers making their opening remarks about the year ahead, the gradual reassertion of the routines that structured school life. Elena moved through all of it with the competence of someone who has always known how to meet institutional expectations, who has never had to work very hard at being a good student, because the habits of attention and effort were formed early and had not, it turned out, been entirely dissolved by grief. They had been suspended. Now they were available again, a little dusty, still functional. And it was in the hallway before lunch that she first saw him. He was at the main office window, which was where new students went to collect their schedules and orientation materials and the various administrative artifacts that a school produces for people who are newly arrived and need to be formally absorbed into the system. He had his back mostly towards her as she passed, and what she registered first was not a face, but a quality of presence. A stillness in the middle of the hallway's noise and movement that was categorically different from ordinary stillness, that had a character to it she could not immediately name or account for. He was not looking at his phone, and he was not shifting his weight or fidgeting with his sleeve, or performing any of the small unconscious movements that people make when they are standing in a public place, waiting for something and feeling the mild self-consciousness that waiting in public produces. He was simply standing with a completeness of stillness that made the activity around him seem, by contrast, slightly frantic, slightly approximate, the way that all ordinary movement seems approximate when placed beside something that is entirely precise. She slowed without meaning to. He turned, in the way that people sometimes turn when they become aware of sustained attention. And for a moment, they were facing each other, across the width of the hallway, and Elena experienced something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not attraction, or not only attraction, and it wasn't recognition in any literal sense because she had never seen this person before in her life. It was something more like the sensation that precedes recognition, the feeling of being on the edge of a memory, of reaching for something that is almost but not quite available. She looked at him and something in her was very still, in a way that mirrored without matching his own stillness. And then the hallway moved between them, and she kept walking, because keeping walking was what you did. His eyes were what stayed with her. She replayed the moment several times over the course of the morning without entirely meaning to, and what she kept returning to was the quality of his attention. Dark eyes, and in them a quality of looking that was different from the way people usually looked at things. Genuinely directed, genuinely engaged with a specific object of attention, rather than simply aimed in a general direction. He had looked at her as if she was the particular thing he was looking at, rather than one item in a visual field containing many items. And beneath that quality of attention, something else, something that looked, from the distance of a brief hallway encounter, like recognition. That was the thing she kept returning to, the look of someone who already knew the face they were looking at, which was impossible because she did not know him and he could not know her. And yet, his name moved through the school the way new information moves in a place where everyone has known everyone for years. And novelty is therefore both rare and enthusiastically processed. And by lunch, she knew from the reliable channels of Mystic Falls High's social communication that the new student was Stefan Salvatore, that he was a junior, that he had enrolled that morning and had already been placed in several junior year classes. She knew because Caroline had apparently already conducted what Caroline referred to as preliminary research, that he was staying at the old Salvatore estate on the edge of town, a property that had been in the family for generations and had been largely unoccupied for as long as most current residents of Mystic Falls could remember. The Salvatore name was a founding family name, present on the same memorials and historical records and council documents as Gilbert and Forbes and Lockwood, and the other names that form the skeletal structure of Mystic Falls' sense of its own identity. Elena had grown up knowing it the way she had grown up knowing all those names, as part of the background of a town that was unusually attentive to its own history, as furniture in the room of her understanding of where she lived. It had never been a name attached to an actual living person in her experience. Now it was. She saw him again in the afternoon, in the history class she'd been reassigned to at the last minute, due to a teacher change. He was already seated when she arrived, 3 rows to her left and 1 seat ahead, close enough for the peripheral attention that does not require obvious looking. She set up her notebook and arranged her materials and was aware of him with the particular sideways awareness of someone trying not to make their awareness visible. He did not look at her when she came in. She noticed this more than she might have expected to notice it, which told her something about the quality of attention she had been paying to him since the hallway encounter that morning. She had assumed. She was not sure what she had assumed exactly, only that the look from the hallway had felt like the beginning of something, and that the absence of its continuation was more notable than the absence of something that had never started would have been. He was still throughout the class in the same way he had been still in the hallway. It was not the stillness of someone who is bored or distracted or mentally elsewhere. It was the stillness of complete presence, of someone whose attention is entirely in the room and requires no physical movement to express itself. The teacher introduced him briefly, the standard new student acknowledgement, and Stefan inclined his head with a courtesy that was genuine and very contained, making no move to offer information about himself beyond what the moment strictly required. After class, in the hallway, it was Stefan who initiated. She was checking her schedule, reorienting herself after the reassignment, when she became aware that he had stopped a few feet away and was waiting. Not hovering, not intruding, simply present in the way of someone who has something to say and is waiting for a moment that is appropriate rather than manufactured. She looked up and he said her name, and the way he said it did what it had done in her imagination of the moment since that morning. It landed as a statement rather than a question, as if the name was something he already held and was simply using in her presence for the first time. She asked how he knew it, which was reasonable, and he said he had heard it at the office that morning, which was plausible in the way that explanations are plausible when they account for the surface of a thing without quite accounting for everything beneath it. She accepted it because she was not yet in possession of the information that would have allowed her to interrogate it further, and because there was something in his manner that made interrogation feel both appropriate and somehow beside the point simultaneously. He introduced himself properly, Stefan Salvatore, and she said she knew, and a slight shift in his expression acknowledged that the smallness of Mystic Falls made this unsurprising, and they stood in the hallway and talked for perhaps 4 minutes about the unremarkable things that two people talk about when they are learning the accessible surface of each other. The school, the town, how he was finding it, whether she had always lived here. He asked questions that were genuine rather than formulaic, questions that suggested he was actually interested in the answers, rather than simply performing the social ritual of seeming interested. She answered with more honesty than she usually offered to near strangers, and was slightly surprised at herself for doing so. She noticed, precisely, and without being able to immediately explain her precision, that he did not ask about her parents. This was the most significant thing about the entire conversation, though she would not have been able to articulate why until she had sat with it for a while. Every conversation she had had today with every other person in this building had contained it in some form. The careful mention, the gentle reference, the acknowledgement of what had happened to her family that functioned as a kind of social orienting, a way of establishing that the speaker was aware of the primary contextual fact about Elena Gilbert and wanted her to know they were aware. Stefan Salvatore talked to her without this. He talked to her as if she was simply a person he had met in a hallway, without the overlay of her loss as a preceding condition. And the relief of this was so immediate and so specific that she felt it physically, a slight easing in the muscles of her shoulders that she had not known were held in anticipation of the familiar weight. She walked away from the conversation with more impression than information. She knew almost nothing concrete about him, beyond what his enrollment had already made public. But she had spent 4 minutes in proximity to him and had come away with the strong and not entirely rational sense that there were depths to this person, that his careful surface did not illuminate and was not intended to illuminate, not hidden in the way of someone concealing something shameful, hidden in the way of someone who has more interior life than they make visible by default, who moves through the world with more going on beneath the surface than is on offer to casual inspection. She recognized this quality because it was, in certain ways, her own. Bonnie was waiting by the truck in the parking lot at the end of the day. She had that particular expression she had been developing over the summer, the one that preceded something she was going to say, despite being uncertain how it would be received, the expression of someone who has decided that honesty about her own perception is more important than the social comfort of keeping it to herself. She told Elena she had a feeling about the new student. Elena asked what kind of feeling. Bonnie looked toward the school and then back and said it was the kind of feeling her grandmother had been trying to teach her to pay attention to. Not fear exactly, not warning exactly, but significance. The sense that something or someone exists at the intersection of more things than are visible on the surface, and that there are lines of connection running through a situation that ordinary perception does not map. She said this in the careful and direct way she had been learning to say this kind of thing, without apology for its strangeness, without insisting that Elena receive it as anything more than what it was. One person reporting honestly what she perceived. Elena stood with her hand on the door of the truck and thought about the look in the hallway. The way he'd said her name with the weight of something already known. The stillness that was unlike ordinary stillness. The way the conversation had moved, careful and genuine, and missing the one element that every other conversation today had contained. She thought about all of this, and she thought about Bonnie's grandmother, and about the things that Bonnie had been saying all summer, that Elena had been taking increasingly seriously, because Bonnie's instincts had not been wrong yet in any instance where they could be checked. She told Bonnie she understood what she meant. This was true without being specific, and Bonnie accepted it as such. She drove home through Mystic Falls in the late afternoon, the familiar streets moving past the windows in the golden light of early September that was different from summer light, cooler and more angular, the light of a season beginning to understand that it is going to change. The town looked the same as it always did. The clock in the square, the memorial at the center of the park, the houses she had known her whole life arranged along streets she had known her whole life. All of it ordinary and specific, and hers in the way that a place is yours when you have grown up inside it and cannot imagine your history unfolding anywhere else. That night she wrote in the diary for longer than she had written in a single entry all summer. She wrote about the day, about the fatigue of condolences, about Bonnie's quiet steadiness, about Caroline's anxious love, about the strangeness of being back in a building that remembered the person she had been before she became this person. And at the end, she wrote about Stefan Salvatore. She wrote that he was still in a way that was different from the way other people were still. She wrote that he had looked at her in the hallway as if he recognized her, and that this should have been unsettling, and had instead felt, without rational explanation, like something adjacent to familiarity. She wrote that he had not asked about her parents, and that this had been the most significant thing anyone had offered her all day, and that it had been offered without intention or awareness, simply by being the natural behavior of someone who was talking to her rather than to the story about her. She wrote that Bonnie had a feeling about him. She did not write what she herself felt, because she had not yet finished feeling it, and she had learned over the course of the summer that some things needed more time before language could reach them accurately. She closed the journal and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Jenna moving in the kitchen downstairs. Had Jeremy's music faint through the wall between their rooms? In a room across Mystic Falls, in the old Salvatore house that smelled of disuse and history, and the particular quality of air that accumulates in spaces that have been closed for a long time. Stefan sat in the dark without sleeping, because sleeping was not something he required, and he thought about a girl in a hallway who had looked at him with no memory of the last time their lives had touched. He thought about the river, and about cold water, and about a man's last words directing him toward the back seat of a sinking car. He thought about what it meant to have come back to this town, and to have found her here, alive and changed and entirely herself, with no knowledge of what had made her survival possible. Like he had come to Mystic Falls to understand the pull that had brought him here. He was beginning to understand it, and the understanding was more complicated than the pull had been, which was the nature of understanding. It resolves one question and opens several others, and the others are always larger than the one you started with. The night settled over Mystic Falls, and the clock marked the hour, and the town continued in its long, continuous, only partially visible life. And the year that had begun at the bottom of a river, in the dark and the cold, was moving towards something that neither the girl nor the vampire on opposite sides of town had yet found the words to name. The weeks that followed the first day of school had a particular quality that Elena would later recognize as the texture of a life reorganizing itself around new information. Not dramatically, not in the way of sudden revelation or the kind of change that announces itself clearly and asks you to respond, but gradually, in the way that water finds its way through stone, not by force but by persistence, by the accumulated weight of small moments that individually mean little and collectively mean everything. She and Stefan began spending time together in the careful, incremental way of two people who are both, for different reasons, being cautious about the thing that is developing between them. It did not begin with intention. It began with proximity and the natural consequences of proximity when two people have the particular quality of attention for each other that Elena and Stefan had from the beginning. They were in the same history class. They were in the same lunch period. They moved through the same school in the same year in the same small town. and Mystic Falls was not large enough to make avoiding someone a natural outcome. So they did not avoid each other, and the not avoiding became something more, in the way that things become more when the conditions for more are already present and only the permission is missing. He walked with her between classes by the second week, which was not something that had been discussed or arranged, but which happened naturally enough that discussing or arranging it would have seemed excessive. He carried her books once when she was also carrying a project for art class and her hands were full, and he did this without making anything of it, without the self-consciousness that such gestures sometimes carry when they are performed with an awareness of their own significance. Elena noticed this quality in him repeatedly, the way he did things without italicizing them, without drawing attention to the doing. It was the opposite of performance. It was just action, clean and direct and without the need for acknowledgement. She talked to him in the way she had not talked to anyone since May 23rd. Not about the grief specifically, not immediately, but with the honesty that the grief had, as an unintended consequence, had given her access to. The quality of directness that comes when you have been through something that stripped away all your investment in presenting a managed version of yourself to the world and left you with the simpler and more exhausting task of simply being present to whatever is actually happening. Stefan received her honesty without flinching, without the slight recoil that honesty sometimes produces in people who were expecting the social performance and are surprised by the real thing. He received it the way someone receives something they have been waiting a long time to be offered, with a care that suggested he understood its value. She began to trust him. This happened more quickly than it should have, probably, and she was aware of this even as it was happening. She was a girl who had learned in the hardest possible way that permanence is not guaranteed, that the people and things you have always assumed will continue can simply stop. And this knowledge had made her simultaneously more open and more cautious in ways that seemed contradictory, but were in fact two responses to the same underlying truth. She was open because life had taught her that the time for the things that matter is now, not later. She was cautious because life had taught her that investment carries risk. With Stefan, the openness was winning, and she noticed this, and she let it. What she did not know, and what Stefan carried in the silence beneath every conversation they had, was the full weight of what he already knew about her. He knew the night of May 23rd from the inside. He knew the temperature of the water and the sound of the impact and the particular quality of Grayson Gilbert's voice in those final seconds. He knew what Elena's face had looked like when he pulled her free of the car, slack and pale and entirely beyond the reach of consciousness. He knew what her heartbeat had sounded like when it came back, the unsteady and then increasingly certain rhythm of a body reasserting its own life. He had carried all of this knowledge through the summer and into the fall and into the specific and daily proximity of a relationship that was becoming real, and he had not said any of it, and the not saying was not neutral. It was an active and continuous choice, renewed every day, to keep this knowledge on his side of the space between them. He told himself it was protective, and he was not entirely wrong about this. Elena was 4 months out from the worst night of her life, and was managing the after of it with a courage and a steadiness that he found genuinely extraordinary, and adding to what she was managing by telling her that the stranger she was beginning to care about had been present at the bridge, had been the hand in the water she could not explain, had been the reason she was alive. This was not obviously the right thing to do. It was information that would require enormous amounts of processing. It was information that would change the context of everything between them retroactively. He was not wrong to hesitate, but he was also not being entirely honest with himself about his hesitation, because the truth, the part he examined less carefully, when it was that telling her would change things in ways he could not fully predict, and the thing that was developing between them was the most alive he had felt in more decades than he wanted to count, and he was not entirely above wanting to protect it from the disruption that the truth would inevitably bring. This was what Stefan Salvatore did not say, and the weight of it lived in the careful quality of everything he did say, in the slight restraint that existed at the edges of his honesty, in the moments when a conversation moved toward the bridge or the accident, and he navigated around it with a precision that was skilled enough to be nearly invisible. Damon Salvatore arrived on a Thursday in late September, and his arrival was not quiet in the way that Stefan's had been quiet. Damon had never done anything quietly in his life, and the transformation that had made him a vampire had not introduced quietness as a new quality. He arrived at the boarding house, the Salvatore property where Stefan had established himself with the careful, low-profile residence of someone trying to exist in a town without drawing attention. And his arrival announced itself in the way that Damon's presence always announced itself, as an atmosphere change, a shift in the quality of the air in a room, the sense that something has entered that is going to require your complete attention whether you want to give it or not. Stefan heard him before he saw him. He heard the particular sound of Damon's movements, recognizable after more than a century and a half of knowing them, and he felt the complicated mixture of things that Damon's proximity always produced. The love that had never died regardless of everything that had happened to it, the grief for what the relationship between them had been and what it had become, the wariness of someone who knows exactly what the person approaching is capable of and has stopped being surprised by any of it. They had not been in the same place for several years. The distance between them was not accidental. It was the managed distance of two people who love each other and have hurt each other badly enough that proximity requires careful negotiation. Damon did not negotiate carefully. He arrived when he arrived, for his own reasons, and the reasons were always eventually clear, and they were rarely simple. He stood in the doorway of the boarding house library and looked at Stefan with the particular expression he had developed over the decades, amused and sharp, and carrying beneath the amusement a depth of feeling that he had long since learned to armor with irony, with performance, with the defensive cruelty that kept people at a distance that he preferred to claim he wanted. He had come for Catherine. This was the reason, the real and driving reason beneath whatever else Damon chose to present. Catherine Pierce, the vampire who had turned both Salvatore brothers in 1864, who had loved them both in the way that Catherine loved things, which was to say selectively and strategically, and with a completeness that felt absolute until it didn't, was sealed in the tomb beneath Fell's Church at the edge of Mystic Falls. Her also Damon believed. He had believed it for 145 years, had organized his entire existence around the project of freeing her, had crossed and recrossed the country in the long decades of her absence, carrying the absolute conviction that she was waiting, that she loved him, that the reunion he was working toward would be everything he had been telling himself it would be across a century and a half of anticipation. The tomb required a grimoire to open. The grimoire belonged to the Bennett family and had been in Mystic Falls for generations. Damon had come to retrieve it, to use it, to open the tomb, to end the waiting that had constituted the primary project of his immortal life. Stefan knew this. He knew it because he knew Damon, knew the obsession with Catherine that had survived everything. Betrayal, death, armed transformation, the slow accumulation of evidence across decades that Catherine Pierce was not what Damon had decided she was. He knew it, and he felt for his brother the complicated and painful compassion of someone watching a person he loves organize himself around the grief that is not quite grief and a love that is not quite love, but that has become so foundational to his identity that dismantling it would require dismantling something essential about who he is. Damon's relationship to Elena's existence was immediate and layered. He saw her for the first time from the window of the boarding house, across the distance of the front property, and the stillness that came over him in that moment was different from Stefan's stillness. It was the stillness of shock, of an internal system encountering something that does not compute and requiring a moment to reprocess. She looked exactly like Catherine, not approximately, not with the slight resemblances that sometimes appear between people who share a bloodline or a regional gene pool. Exactly. The face, the hair, the quality of movement, the way she occupied space. Catherine, walking through the early October light of Mystic Falls in jeans and a jacket, alive and human and somehow here. He turned to Stefan and his expression said everything before his words did. Stefan held his gaze and said her name. Elena Gilbert. And something in Damon's face shifted, moving through the shock into something more calculating, more interested. The expression of someone who has encountered a puzzle and has immediately begun taking it apart. Where Stefan's response to Elena's resemblance to Catherine had been caution, the recognition that Elena was not Catherine, the deliberate and careful attention to who Elena actually was rather than who she looked like. Damon's response was provocation. This was their fundamental difference, the one that had been true even before the transformation, and that the transformation had amplified rather than created. Stefan moved toward things carefully, with the awareness of consequence. Damon moved toward things to see what would happen, with a willingness to accept consequence as the price of finding out. He introduced himself to Elena within the week, in the way that Damon introduced himself to things, directly, without the usual social scaffolding of gradual acquaintance, presenting himself fully and immediately, and with the complete confidence of someone who has never had meaningful reason to doubt his own effect on the people he encounters. He was charming. He was genuinely, compellingly charming, in the way of someone whose intelligence and aesthetic sensibility and complete comfort in his own skin combine into something that is very difficult to look away from. Elena recognized the charm and also recognized something underneath it, the edge beneath the surface, the sense that the charm was not a concealment of something worse, but was instead genuinely coextensive with something more dangerous. She told Stefan about the encounter the following day. She described Damon with the careful accuracy she brought to descriptions of things she was still working out. And Stefan listened with the expression he wore when he was managing his own reaction to something, while simultaneously responding to hers. He told her that Damon was his brother, that they had a complicated history, that Damon was not someone whose company she should seek out. He said this without the dramatic warning that would have made it seem more alarming than he wanted it to seem, with the measured understatement of someone trying to convey the essential truth of a situation without triggering the curiosity that too much emphasis would inevitably produce. Elena heard the understatement and heard also what lived beneath it, and she filed it accurately. Damon Salvatore was someone to be careful around. She did not yet know why in any specific sense, but she had learned over the past months to trust the information that arrived through the quality of someone's voice rather than the content of their words. And Stefan's voice, when he spoke about his brother, carried information she believed. Caroline Forbes was not careful. This was not a character flaw so much as a condition of being Caroline. She moved through the world with an openness that was also a vulnerability, offering herself to situations and people with a generosity that did not always stop to assess whether the situation or person in question warranted the offer. Damon encountered this openness and did what Damon did, which was to use it. He was attentive to Caroline in the way of someone who has identified exactly what a person needs to be given in order to lower their defenses, and he gave it the attention, the charm, and the complete and focused quality of presence that made Caroline feel, for the first time in recent memory, genuinely seen rather than simply observed. He compelled her. Elena did not know this yet. Caroline did not know it either, which was the nature of compulsion. The memory it targeted was simply gone, replaced by an explanation that felt internally coherent, even though it had been installed from outside. She felt strange sometimes in the mornings, with stretches of the previous evening that she could not account for. She put this down to tiredness, to the stress of junior year, to explanations that were available and comfortable, and asked nothing of her understanding of the world. The vervain came quietly. Stefan brought it to Elena in the second week of October, a small glass vial on a chain, and he told her it was something meaningful to him, something he wanted her to have. He did not tell her what it was, not by name, not by function. He told her to wear it close, to keep it on, with a care in his voice that was not quite casual, but that he was working to present as casual, as a gesture of sentiment rather than of protection. Elena accepted it as the gesture it appeared to be, which was an act of trust from someone who did not give those easily. And she put it on and wore it because it mattered to him, and because things that mattered to Stefan were beginning, she found, to matter to her as well. The necklace kept Damon's compulsion from reaching her. She walked past him in the hallways and sat across from him at the grill when the social configurations of Mystic Falls occasionally put them in the same space, and she felt his attention and was aware of the particular quality of it. Assessing, curious, carrying the Catherine comparison always just below the surface. And she was not compelled, and she did not know she was being protected. And Stefan watched this from his own careful distance and did not explain. This was the pattern of what Stefan didn't say. Not one secret, but an architecture of omissions, each one individually justifiable, collectively constituting a significant withholding. He had not told her about the bridge. He had not told her about the vervain. He had not told her what Damon was capable of, or why the necklace was protection rather than sentiment. He had not told her what he was. Elena felt the withholding without being able to name it. She was perceptive enough, had always been perceptive, and grief had sharpened the perception further, had removed the social willingness to overlook the things that don't quite add up. To know that there were spaces in Stefan's honesty, places where something was present that he was choosing not to hand to her directly. She did not press, not yet, because she was still learning the territory between them, and because the thing developing between them was too valuable to risk with demands she was not yet certain were warranted. But she noticed the way certain topics produced in Stefan a quality of careful navigation. She noticed that he was always exactly where she was without ever being asked, which spoke to an awareness of her location and movements that exceeded what ordinary attention produced. She noticed that the hand in the water, so the memory she had been carrying since May and writing around in the diary all summer, felt less impossible when he was near. Not because anything had been explained, but because his presence had a quality that resonated with that cold and certain hand in a way she could not explain, and had not yet tried to explain aloud to anyone. One afternoon, in the third week of October, sitting beside him on the bleachers after school with the practice field empty and the light going amber and thin in the way of light in autumn, Elena said to him directly that she knew he was keeping something from her. She did not frame it as an accusation. She did not have enough specific information to make it an accusation. She framed it as an observation, stated plainly and without drama, and the way she had learned to state things since May, because the energy required to approach truth indirectly was energy she no longer had available for that purpose. Stefan looked at her for a long moment before he responded. She watched him in the amber light and thought that he looked, in that moment, like someone who is carrying something heavy and has been doing so for so long that the weight has become part of how he stands, part of how he breathes, part of how he occupies space. He looked like someone for whom the question she had just asked was not a surprise, but a threshold, a moment that had been approaching and had now arrived. He said that she was right, and that he was sorry, and that there were things he needed to tell her, that he was not yet ready to tell her in the right way, and that the right way mattered to him more than the telling. He said this with a care and a specificity that suggested he had thought about it, not in the moment, but before, in the space where he had been living with what he knew and what he was choosing not to say. Elena sat with this. She was quiet for long enough that the silence had weight, and then she said that she understood the instinct to protect people from information by withholding it, that she had been protected that way her whole life in ways she was only now beginning to understand, and that it had never worked the way the protector intended. She said this without anger, which made it land more accurately than anger would have. She said it as information she was offering him about how protection felt from the inside of it. He heard her. She could tell he heard her in the particular way he had of receiving the things she said, the quality of attention that suggested her words were being taken seriously rather than simply acknowledged. He did not respond immediately, which was also the right thing, because immediately would have felt like a deflection dressed as engagement. What he said eventually was this: soon. He would tell her soon. Not because she had demanded it, but because she deserved it. And because the gap between what he knew and what she knew was a distance that was becoming harder to sustain as the thing between them became more real. She walked home through the October dusk, and the town was its familiar self around her. The founding family houses and the church steeples and the clock in the square marking the hour. And she thought about soon, and about all the things that a word was being asked to carry. She thought about what she already knew, which was more than Stefan understood she knew, because Elena Gilbert had been paying very careful attention to Stefan Salvatore since the day he said her name in a hallway, with the weight of something already held, and the picture she had assembled from that attention was not yet complete, but it was also not as empty as he perhaps believed. She turned up the collar of her jacket against the evening chill and walked on through Mystic Falls, carrying her own careful collection of things not yet said, moving through a town that was keeping its oldest secrets with the practiced ease of something that has been doing it for generations, and toward a house where her brother's light was already on, and her aunt was already making something that might or might not be edible. Toward the night and the diary and the page where she would write down what she knew and what she didn't, and try once more to find the shape of what was coming. The founders' party was held on the last Saturday of October in the grand old Lockwood estate that served as the unofficial seat of Mystic Falls social authority in the way that certain houses in certain towns always do. Not because anyone has formally designated them as such, but because the combination of size and age and family reputation creates a gravitational pull that organizes events around itself without requiring explicit invitation. The Lockwood House had hosted the founders' party for as long as anyone currently living in Mystic Falls could remember, and probably longer than that, its ballroom and its grounds providing the particular backdrop that the evening required. Old wood and high ceilings and the kind of chandelier light that makes everyone look slightly more significant than they do in ordinary illumination. Elena had been to the founders' party before. She had attended every year since she was old enough to be brought along. First, as a child in the formal dress her mother had always chosen with great seriousness. Later, as a teenager, with the slightly self-conscious awareness of someone who understood the social weight of the event without being entirely comfortable inside it. It was the kind of evening that Mystic Falls took seriously in a way that people from outside might find difficult to understand. The founding families gathering to acknowledge their own history, the town performing its identity to itself in the formal and slightly anachronistic language of this annual ritual. As a Gilbert, Elena had always had a place at the center of it. Her father had always been on the organizing committee. Her mother had always been on the decoration subcommittee, a role she had carried out with the same warm and focused competence she brought to everything. This year was the first year without them. She dressed carefully, in a way that was deliberate rather than vain, choosing something that would allow her to be present at this event as herself, rather than as the spectacle of her own grief. The black dress she had considered and then put back, because black would have made the grief the loudest thing in the room, and she did not want the grief to be the loudest thing. She chose deep burgundy instead, which was formal without being theatrical, and she wore her hair down, and she wore the small glass vial on his chain that Stefan had given her. and she looked in the mirror before leaving and made the assessment she had been making every morning since June. Present, manageable, moving forward. Stefan was waiting for her outside, which was something they had arrived at without formally discussing it. The natural consequence of weeks of proximity and the slow accumulation of something between them that had not yet been named, but that governed their behavior with the authority of things that have been decided, even if they have not been spoken. He was in a dark jacket, and his collar was open, which on him looked like restraint rather than casualness. And when she came down the porch steps and he looked at her, there was something in his expression that she had learned over the preceding weeks to recognize. The quality of someone managing the gap between what they feel and what the situation allows them to demonstrate. He told her she looked beautiful. He said it in the way he said things that mattered, without flourish, without the self-consciousness that would have made it a performance. Elena accepted it in the way she was learning to accept things from Stefan, as information, accurate and intended. The Lockwood estate was already alive with light and movement when they arrived. Cars filling the long drive, and voices carrying through the open windows of the ballroom out into the cool October air. Stefan held the door, and Elena went in, and the room received them with the particular attention that Mystic Falls social gatherings gave to new configurations. People noting who had arrived together, what it meant, how it fit into the ongoing social narrative that a small town maintains about its members. Elena felt the attention without being stopped by it. She had been the subject of this town's attention for 4 months in the context of grief, and attention in the context of something that was almost joy felt easier to carry. Carol Lockwood greeted them at the entrance, the mayor's wife performing her hostessing role with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing it for decades. Her warmth genuine even when it was also efficient. She took Elena's hands and said something kind about her parents, brief and sincere and then complete, which was exactly the right calibration. Acknowledging without dwelling, honoring without making it the entire exchange. Elena was grateful for the calibration. She had not always received it this correctly. The room was full of founding family names made flesh. The Forbes contingent, anchored by Sheriff Liz Forbes, Caroline's mother, who had the particular quality of someone who is always simultaneously a person at a party and a professional assessing an environment. Mayor Richard Lockwood, Tyler's father, moving through the room with the self-satisfaction of a man entirely comfortable in the space his family name has created for him. The Salvatores were represented now for the first time in years by Stefan's quiet presence, which several of the older guests registered with the complicated interest of people encountering a piece of history they had not expected to become current again. Caroline arrived late, because Caroline always arrived late to things despite intending not to, and her arrival was its own small event. She came in with the particular energy of someone who has put significant effort into looking effortless, who cares deeply about the impression she is making while also genuinely wanting the people she loves to be having a good time. She found Elena immediately, which she always did, drawn by the unerring social navigation that was one of Caroline's genuine gifts beneath all the surface performance. She looked at Stefan beside Elena, and then back at Elena, with the expression of someone conducting a rapid internal assessment. And then she arranged her face into the warmth that was always there underneath the assessment, because Caroline loved Elena, and caring about Elena meant caring about what Elena cared about. Bonnie came with her grandmother, which was unusual. Sheila Bennett attended the founders' party most years, but usually she came alone, an awe with the quiet and self-contained quality of someone who is present at an event without being fully of it. This year she had brought Bonnie, and the way she moved through the room suggested purpose rather than sociality. The purposeful quality of someone who has come not to celebrate but to observe, who is gathering information that the setting makes available in forms that other settings do not. Sheila Bennett was a woman of considerable knowledge and considerable discretion about what she did with that knowledge. She had been aware of the Salvatore family's history in Mystic Falls since long before Stefan's return, in the way that the Bennett women had always been aware of the supernatural threads running through the town's fabric. She had noted Stefan's arrival with the careful attention of someone for whom his presence was not surprising in principle, but was significant in timing, in the specific fact of his appearing now, in this year, in proximity to Elena Gilbert. She'd said very little to Bonnie about this, because Bonnie was still early in her understanding of what she was and what she could do. And Sheila was a woman who believed in the right time for information. But she had brought her granddaughter to this party because she believed that Bonnie's own perception, given the right exposure, would begin to do the work that explanations would eventually need to support. Elena moved through the room with Stefan at the measured pace of a social event that requires presence across multiple conversations rather than depth in any single one, as she introduced Stefan to people who had not yet met him, watching the way he navigated these introductions with the particular skill of someone who has had a great deal of practice at presenting a version of himself that is genuine without being complete. He was charming in the understated way that was natural to him, attentive to people in the conversation in a way that made them feel individually regarded. And Elena noticed the effect he had, and noticed also that he seemed entirely unaware of producing it, which was what separated genuine attentiveness from performed attentiveness. The Gilbert family's history in Mystic Falls was present throughout the evening, in the way that absence is sometimes more present than presence, in the gap at the organizing committee's table where Grayson's name would have appeared, and in the moment when someone mentioned the Gilbert family's historical research with the slightly careful tone of someone referring to something they are not entirely sure how much the surviving family member knows about. Elena caught this careful tone twice, from two different people, and both times she filed it in the growing category of things about her father. She was beginning to understand. She did not fully understand. Her father had been many things she knew entirely. Grayson Gilbert, the doctor, the Sunday morning breakfast maker, the awkward but genuine provider of paternal wisdom on the occasions that required it. But Grayson Gilbert had also had a study with a door that was sometimes closed, and a set of keys whose purposes she had never catalogued, and a quality of knowing the town's older residents with a depth that exceeded what medicine alone would explain. She had begun to think about this more precisely in recent weeks, as the context of the town she was growing up in had begun to reveal additional dimensions. The Founders' Party, with its celebration of legacy and continuity, was a room full of people who had known her father in ways she was only beginning to suspect. She did not have enough information yet to ask the right questions, but she was collecting what was available. The founding council was not a thing that was announced at the party. It was not on any program or mentioned in any of the evening's formal remarks. It was instead a thing that moved beneath the event like a current beneath a surface, present in the brief, quiet conversations between specific people. In the eye contact across rooms that carried information, in the small groupings that formed and dissolved with the practiced naturalness of people who have been coordinating with each other in semi-public spaces for years. Sheriff Forbes and Mayor Lockwood and Carol Lockwood and 3 or 4 others whose families had been in Mystic Falls since the beginning, moved through the party with a quality of shared purpose that expressed itself too subtly to be obvious to someone who was not already looking for it. Elena was looking for it because she was a girl who had been paying close attention to the texture of things since May 23rd, and the texture of this room had a quality she was learning to recognize. The quality of a surface that is doing active work. That is maintaining an appearance while something else is being maintained underneath it. She said nothing of this to Stefan, but she noted it. Vicky Donovan was at the party in the peripheral way that Vicky occupied most spaces. Present, visible, belonging to the edges rather than the center, carrying the particular self-consciousness of someone who is at an event because of who they know rather than who they are. She was Jeremy's girlfriend in the complicated and not entirely stable way that adolescent relationships in grief are complicated and not entirely stable. Jeremy had brought her, which was itself a small but real indicator that Jeremy was still capable of moving toward things rather than purely away from them. Elena registered this with the particular mix of relief and anxiety that she brought to all observations about her brother's state. What Elena did not know, watching Vicky across the room, was that Damon Salvatore had been paying attention to Vicky for weeks. Not the attentive and genuine kind of attention that Stefan paid to things. The other kind. The kind that catalogues vulnerability and calculates access and moves toward whatever serves its own purposes with complete and unapologetic efficiency. Damon had been feeding on Vicky, compelling away the memory of it, using her as the most convenient and least complicated available source in a town where his options were constrained by his brother's watchfulness and his own strategic need not to draw attention before he had accomplished what he had come to accomplish. He was at the party too, of course. He moved through it with the ease of someone who is entirely comfortable in formal social settings because he has been navigating them for a century and a half and no longer finds them requiring of anything he cannot provide automatically. He spoke to people with the focused attention he deployed when he wanted something from the conversation, and he looked across the room at Elena more than once, with the Catherine comparison still running somewhere behind his eyes, complicated now by the weeks of observing her as herself rather than as a resemblance, discovering, as Stefan had discovered before him, that Elena Gilbert was a specific and substantial person whose resemblance to Catherine was the most superficial thing about her. At the conversation that changed the evening's register for Elena happened near the drinks table, when she found herself briefly alongside Liz Forbes in one of the natural pauses of a party where 2 people are both between conversations and the proximity suggests exchange. Liz Forbes had a quality of directness that her daughter had inherited. and that expressed itself differently in the mother, tempered by 20 years of law enforcement and the professional habit of providing information carefully rather than completely. She asked Elena how she was managing, which was the standard opener, and Elena gave the standard answer, and then Liz said something that departed from the standard. She said that Grayson would have been proud of how Elena was handling this year, as she said it the way someone says something true that is also carrying weight they have not decided whether to put down. And then she said that if Elena ever had questions about her father's work, his research, the things he was involved in beyond the medical practice, she should feel free to come to her. The invitation was brief, and then it was complete, and Liz Forbes moved away with the smooth competence of someone who has delivered exactly as much as she intended to deliver, and no more. Elena stood at the drinks table with a glass she was not drinking and passed what had just been offered. Her father's research, the things he was involved in, the careful language of someone who knew the content of those things but was not yet prepared to lay them out in full. She found Stefan at the edge of the room and near the tall windows that looked out onto the Lockwood grounds, and she went to him. Not because she was going to tell him what Liz Forbes had said. She was not ready to do that yet, was still processing it herself, turning it carefully in the space where she kept the things that needed examination before sharing. She went to him because the evening had accumulated its various weights, and Stefan's presence was the thing that reliably made weight feel carryable rather than crushing, and she was no longer embarrassed by this fact about herself. He looked at her when she approached in the way he always looked at her, with the complete attention that she had initially noticed and was now simply accustomed to, the quality of being seen rather than observed. He asked with his expression rather than his words whether she was all right, and which was the right question delivered in the right register, and she said yes with her expression in return, which was approximately as accurate as her expressions usually were. They stood together at the edge of the ballroom and watched the Founders Party do what it did. The founding families of Mystic Falls performing their continuity, their investment in their own history, the annual ritual of remembering who they were and where they came from and what they had undertaken to protect. The chandelier light moved across faces Elena had known her whole life. The music was something classical and slightly too formal for the actual temperature of the evening. But no one had ever suggested changing it, because changing it would have required admitting that the formality was a construction rather than an inheritance. And Mystic Falls was not a town that found that kind of honesty comfortable. Bonnie appeared beside Elena in the quiet way she sometimes appeared, without announcement, as if she had been there slightly longer than the moment she became visible. She looked at Stefan with the expression she had been wearing since September, the one that said she was still working out what she was perceiving and was not going to present a conclusion before she had finished the work. Then she looked at Elena with a different expression entirely, warmer and more certain, the expression of someone who knows the person they are looking at well enough to read what is happening beneath the surface. She said quietly, so that only Elena could hear, that her grandmother wanted to meet Stefan. Not tonight, not here, but soon. Elena looked at Bonnie and then at Stefan, who was watching the room with a quality of presence that never fully relaxed even in social situations, that always maintained a peripheral awareness of everything happening around him. She thought about what soon meant when Sheila Bennett was the one assigning it. She thought about what Bonnie had been saying since September about significance and intersecting lines. She said she would ask him. The evening moved toward its end in the gradual way of formal events that are sustained by obligation as much as enjoyment. The room thinning as families made their departures, the chandelier light seeming slightly less transformative as the night wore on and the ordinary world reasserted its claims, and Elena said the goodbyes that were expected of her and carried them off with the competence she had been building all year, the skill of being present in social situations, while also carrying things that the situations did not have room to acknowledge. On the drive home, Stefan was quiet in the way he was sometimes quiet. Not withdrawn, not absent, but internal. The quality of someone processing something they are not yet ready to make external. Elena let the quiet exist because she had things of her own to process, and because the silence between them had become, over the weeks, a comfortable thing rather than an uncomfortable one. The silence of two people who do not need to fill space with noise in order to feel that the space between them is occupied. At her door, he held her gaze for a moment longer than the occasion required, or in the way he sometimes did when he was close to saying something he had not yet decided to say. The almost saying had become a familiar quality in him, something she tracked and waited for without pressing, understanding that Stefan moved toward truth on his own timeline, and that the timeline was not careless even when it was slow. She went inside. She leaned against the closed door in the hallway and listened to the house around her. Jenna's television faint from the living room, the ordinary sounds of the night. She thought about Liz Forbes at the drinks table, and about Sheila Bennett wanting to meet Stefan, and about her father's study with the door that was sometimes closed. She thought about the necklace against her collarbone, and about all the things that had been given to her in this town as protection without being named as protection. All the care that was also concealment, all the love that was also withholding. She was a girl standing in the hallway of her parents' house, in a town that had been keeping its oldest secrets for longer than any of its current residents had been alive. And she was beginning, with a slow and unstoppable momentum of genuine perception, to understand the shape of what she had been living inside without knowing it. The clock in the square marked 11. The Founders' Party was over for another year. The town of Mystic Falls had performed its remembering and would now return to its ordinary surfaces, leaving the deeper things where they lived. Below, in the dark, I'm in the architecture of a community that has decided collectively and over generations that some truths are managed better than they are told. But the managing was getting harder, and the truth was getting closer. And Elena Gilbert, standing in her hallway with her hand still on the door, was no longer the girl who could be protected from it by people who loved her and meant well. She was someone else now, someone the year had made. And that person was going to need answers, and was going to find them. And the town that had kept its secret so carefully for so long was going to have to reckon with what it had built inside its walls without her knowledge or her consent. The confrontation did not happen dramatically, and this was one of the things Elena would remember most clearly about it afterward. That the moment when the architecture of her understanding of the world shifted permanently was not accompanied by the dramatic staging that such moments receive in stories. There was no storm, no raised voices, no single terrible revelation delivered in a way that made its importance immediately legible. It happened in the quiet of an ordinary afternoon, in the incremental and almost gentle way that certain inevitable things happen when they have been building long enough that their arrival, when it finally comes, feels less like an explosion and more like a door opening onto something that was always on the other side. She had been watching him for weeks with the specific attention of someone who is assembling a picture from fragments, and the picture had been assembling itself with a clarity that she could no longer pretend was not there. It was in the small impossibilities that she had been cataloguing with the methodical care of a girl who had always been good and noticing what did not add up, and had become since May significantly less willing to let things that did not add up go unexamined. The speed with which he sometimes moved at the edge of her vision, in moments when he did not know he was being watched. The quality of his stillness, which she had characterized to herself as unusual from the beginning, and which she now understood was not simply a personality trait, but something more categorical. The cold of his skin, which she had touched often enough now to know was not situational, but consistent, present in every season and every temperature, a fact about his body, rather than a response to conditions. The way he never ate in her presence, the way his eyes changed, subtly but perceptibly, in ways that tracked with his moods, but that went beyond what pupil dilation and the ordinary expressiveness of eyes could account for. She had gone to the library. Not the school library, the public library, the old one on the main street, with its local history section that was larger and more specific than the libraries of comparable towns, because Mystic Falls had always taken the documentation of its own history seriously. She had read about the founding families. She had read about the 1860s and the events that the official histories described with a slightly evasive language of accounts that are leaving something out. Or she had found references to the Salvatore family that extended back further than any living family member could account for. References that described certain individuals with a consistency across decades that should not have been possible. She had read the Quileute legends that her own town's native histories gestured toward without elaborating. The stories about the things that walked at night and did not age and sustained themselves on blood. And she had sat with those stories in the afternoon light of the library and felt them land differently than they would have landed 6 months ago, with the weight of something that is being recognized rather than encountered for the first time. She did not go to Stefan with a theory. She went to him with what she knew, which was more precise and more useful than a theory, and because a theory can be deflected, and what she knew could not. She found him at the edge of the old cemetery, which was where he sometimes went in the late afternoons in the way of someone who finds a particular kind of company in old places, in the accumulated quiet of spaces that have been holding time for longer than most places are asked to hold it. He was standing near one of the older sections where the headstones dated from the 1800s, and she came to stand beside him, and they were both quiet for a moment in the way they were often quiet together. And then Elena said his name in the tone that meant she was not beginning a casual conversation. He looked at her, and she saw him understand. She saw it in the quality of stillness that came over him, undifferent from his usual stillness. Not the controlled and managed stillness of someone navigating the world carefully, but the stillness of someone who has arrived at the moment they have been anticipating and is making the final decision about how to meet it. She saw him decide, and the decision, when it settled in his expression, was toward her, toward honesty, toward the telling that he had been holding back with the promise of soon, and soon had arrived. He told her he was a vampire. He said it the way he said things that mattered, directly, without preamble, without the softening that would have been a form of condescension. He said it and let the words exist in the air between them, without rushing to fill the space around them with explanation or reassurance. He gave her the fact first, which was the right order, and waited for her to receive it before offering what came after. Elena stood in the old cemetery in the November light and held what he had just given her. She did not run. She had known, in the way of someone who has been assembling a picture for weeks, that the picture was going to resolve into something extraordinary, and the word vampire was extraordinary, but it was also, she found, not entirely surprising. It was the word that the picture had been moving toward. Hearing it was more like confirmation than revelation. The satisfaction of a shape finally made explicit that had been implicit for longer than she had acknowledged. She asked him how old he was. He told her he was born in 1847, that he had been 17 when he was turned in 1864 in Mystic Falls, are in the events that the local histories described with their careful evasiveness. She did the arithmetic without help. He was over 160 years old, standing beside her in a cemetery where some of the people he had known in his human life were buried, wearing a face that had not changed since the year before the Civil War ended. She asked about Catherine. This was the question he had known was coming, and she saw him prepare for it. Not with resistance, but with the gathering of something, the collection of the care he wanted to bring to telling her something that was going to be painful in multiple directions. He told her about Catherine Pierce, the vampire who had come to Mystic Falls in 1864, who had captivated both Salvatore brothers, and who had turned them both without the full and honest consent that turning required to be anything other than an act of power. He told her about the resemblance, that Eleanor's face was Catherine's face in a way that went beyond coincidence, that this resemblance was the reason he had come back to Mystic Falls, that he had arrived in this town looking for an explanation of something inexplicable, and had found instead a person who made the inexplicability seem, if not less mysterious, then less important than he had expected. He told her that she was not Catherine. He said this with a precision and a care that made it clear he was not offering it as a compliment, but as the most important factual distinction he had made in recent memory. He had spent the first days after seeing her checking the resemblance against the reality of who she was, looking for Catherine in her behavior and her manner and her choices, and finding consistently and completely Elena instead. Elena, who was kind without calculation. Elena, who was honest without strategy. Elena, who grieved openly and chose carefully and trusted slowly and loved when she loved, with the total and unglamorous commitment of someone who means it. She stood with all of this. She stood in the cemetery with the November light going thin and cold around them, and she held what he had given her and let it settle into the picture she had been building. And the picture became suddenly and completely clear, not simple. Nothing about it was simple, but clear in the way that things become clear when the missing piece is finally present, and everything that had been slightly out of alignment resolves into coherence. I actually asked him about the bridge. She did not know she was going to ask it until the question was already formed and spoken, but it arrived with the inevitability of something that had been waiting underneath everything else. The question that all the other questions had been circling. The bridge, the hand, the cold and the certainty, and the thing in the water that was not ordinary, and that she had been carrying in the back of every diary entry since June. The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever experienced in his company. He told her that he had been in Mystic Falls the night of May 23rd, drawn by something he had not been able to explain or resist. He told her that he had been on the western bank when the car went off the bridge. He told her that he had gone into the water, happy that he had reached the car, that her father had been conscious and had pointed toward the back seat and had said her name, and that he had taken Elena first and had brought her up through the dark water and set her on the bank and waited until he was certain someone was coming before he left. He told her that he had not gone back, that the seconds had passed and the car had shifted, and he had held her on the bank while her heart came back and the time he had used could not be recovered. He told her this with the complete and unflinching honesty of someone who has been carrying a thing long enough to know that the carrying has to end, that the weight of it belongs in the open, where both people can see it, rather than on one side of a relationship that has been built, however genuinely, over a foundation of withheld truth. And Elena listened to all of it. The grief that moved through her in those moments was not simple, and was not only grief. It was layered in the way that things are layered when they contain multiple truths simultaneously. The truth that her father had made a choice in his last seconds that had saved her life. The truth that a stranger had honored that choice without knowing who she was. The truth that the hand she had been trying to remember and explain for 6 months had a face and a name, and was standing in front of her. The truth that she had survived because of a chain of events that had nothing to do with chance. The car and the water and the cold, and the decision made in the dark by a man who loved his daughter enough to direct the available salvation away from himself and toward her. Her father had chosen her, and in the most complete and final sense of choosing, he had pointed at her and said her name and let go. She had known he loved her. She had known it in the ordinary way of children who have been well loved and have never had reason to doubt it. But this was something beyond the ordinary knowing. This was evidence of a love so total that it expressed itself as pure will, at the moment when will was the only thing left. She held this, and it was enormous, and it was unbearable, and it was also somehow in the deepest and most honest part of her, a gift. She did not speak for a long time. Stefan did not fill the silence. He stood beside her in the cemetery in the cold November light and let her be inside what she was inside, which was the right thing, the only right thing, and she was aware of it being right even in the middle of everything she was feeling. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady in the particular way that voices are steady, when steadiness is a choice rather than a condition. She asked him why he had not told her. He said what she already knew, that he had wanted to protect her, that he had not known how to offer it in a way that would not damage what was developing between them before it had the chance to become what it was becoming, that he had been afraid. He said the last thing plainly and without excuse, which she appreciated, because afraid was the honest word, and dressing it in more strategic language would have been a disservice to both of them. She told him that she understood the fear. She told him that she had spent 6 months being protected from things by people who loved her, and that the protection, however genuinely intended, had always cost her something. The ability to prepare, the ability to choose, the ability to hold the full truth of her own life in her own hands, rather than receiving the edited version that other people decided she could manage. She said this without anger that was directed at him specifically, because her father had done it, and Jenna had done it, and the entire town had been doing it in various forms for as long as she could remember. And Stefan had done it too. And what she felt about all of it together was not anger, but something more like the weariness of someone who has understood a pattern and is deciding clearly and finally that the pattern ends here, and she told him she needed him to tell her the truth from this point forward. All of it, even the pieces that were difficult or that he thought she might not be ready for. She told him she was more capable of handling the truth than the people who loved her had historically given her credit for, and that she would rather know the hard thing than be protected from it by someone who decided on her behalf what she could bear. He agreed. He gave her his word in the simple and direct way he gave things that mattered, without ceremony, without the inflation of language that would have suggested the promise needed dressing up to be sufficient. His word plainly offered, and she accepted it plainly. They walked back through the cemetery in the dimming afternoon, through the old stones and the older silence, and Elena felt the particular quality of a life that has just been reorganized around new information. Not lighter, not heavier, but differently weighted. The distribution of what she was carrying shifting into a configuration that was more honest, if not more comfortable. She knew what Stefan was. She knew what her father had done. She knew that her survival was not the random grace of good fortune, but the result of a choice made in the dark by a dying man who loved her completely, and of a stranger who had honored that choice and then spent months finding the courage to stand in front of her and be honest about it. She knew that the world was larger and older and stranger than she had been allowed to understand, that the town she had grown up in was layered with histories she had not been given access to, and that the founding families and the council and her father's closed study and the key she had never catalogued were all part of an architecture of knowledge that she was only now being admitted to. She knew that Stefan Salvatore, who was 164 years old and had been turned in the town where he was born and had come back to that town because something he could not name had pulled him here, had been in the water on the worst night of her life, had held her, had carried her up through the dark and the cold toward air and light and the continued fact of her own heartbeat. She did not know what to do with all of this. That was the honest answer. She did not know, and she was not going to pretend that knowing and deciding were the same thing, or that the receipt of truth resolved anything cleanly. She was going to need time. She was going to need the diary and the long evenings and the incremental work of a person integrating information that changes the shape of everything they thought they understood. But she knew that she was not going to walk away from Stefan. This was the thing she understood most clearly and most immediately, before she understood anything else. That whatever the complications were and however long they took to work through, The person beside her in the cemetery was someone she was choosing, not the vampire, not the century and a half of history and the Catherine resemblance and the weight of the bridge. Stefan, the specific and particular person who had looked at her in a hallway as if he recognized her, who had listened to her more carefully than anyone had listened to her since before May, who had told her the truth when the truth was hard and waited in the silence while she held it. That person she was choosing. They reached the cemetery gate and went back out into the ordinary world of Mystic Falls, into the familiar streets in the thin light of late afternoon. And the town was its ordinary self around them. The clock in the square, the founding family houses, the surface of a place that had been keeping its deepest nature out of sight for longer than anyone currently living had been keeping anything. Elena walked through it with her hand in Stefan's hand, cold and steady, and she let the town be what it was and let herself be what she was, which was a girl who had survived the unsurvivable and was now, for the first time since May 23rd, beginning to understand the full dimensions of what that survival had cost and what it had been given to her by and what she was going to do with it. The doing was still ahead. The questions were still ahead, most of them. The founding council and her father's research and Damon's obsession with the tomb and Sheila Bennett's careful watching and all the things that Mystic Falls had been managing beneath its surface for generations. All of that was still ahead, still to be encountered and reckoned with and survived. But she was Elena Gilbert, and she had been carried up from the bottom of a river by the hand of someone who would one day stand beside her in a cemetery and tell her the truth. And she had survived that night and every night since. And surviving was what she did. It was what she was made of. Beneath the grief and the performance and the careful management of the version of herself she offered to the world. She was made of the moment her heart had come back on the bank of the river in the dark, and everything since then had been the working out of what that return meant and what it was for. She was beginning now to find out. Outro. There is a version of Elena Gilbert's story that begins with a car going off a bridge and ends there too, with loss, with a cold, with the particular silence of a life interrupted before it understood itself. That version is not wrong. The bridge was real. The water was real. The absence of her parents is a permanent and undiminishing fact that she carries in every room she enters and every choice she makes. But there is another version, truer in the ways that matter most, as in which the bridge is not an ending, but a threshold, in which the worst night of her life was also the night that set in motion everything she would become. The grief that deepened her, the year that remade her, the stranger who came back to the town where he was born, because something larger than coincidence was arranging the pieces of a story that neither of them had chosen, and both of them were, in the end, choosing anyway. Her father pointed toward the back seat in the dark water and said her name and let go. A vampire honored that direction without knowing why. A girl came up from the river and spent a year learning how to breathe again, and walked back into the world she had always known, and found it larger and stranger and more ancient than she had been told. What if the worst night of your life was never an accident? What if the love that saved you had been there, in one form or another, all along, in the cold hand in the dark water, in the careful attention of someone learning your voice, in the truth finally offered in a cemetery in November light. Elena Gilbert survived. She is still surviving in all the ways that matter. And the story of how she does it is only just beginning. So rest now. Let the river carry you somewhere quiet, somewhere the cold is only the beginning of warmth, and the dark is only the beginning of light. Good night.